We love Classical Conversations.
Your organization is known worldwide, and we certainly appreciate every facet that you do.
I do believe in what you're doing because I've seen it in my family.
I'm so excited about all the things that, Robert, you guys do with Classical Conversations. It's been a huge blessing for our family.
Grateful for the work at Classical Conversations. You're a leader, and you have been in this movement for a long time.
I do feel like I have a debt of gratitude to you, your family, all of CC for just the fruit that has come from CC.
Appreciate all that you guys do, both through this wonderful podcast and also through Classical Conversations, which I am convinced is the best education resource out there. Thank you very much for all that you do for the cause of Christ and for our families and for our children. Really, really appreciate it.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another exciting episode of Refining Rhetoric. I am here with one of the homeschooling pioneers, a friend of mine. I've known her for well over a decade, Zan Tyler. She began her homeschooling journey in 1984. The South Carolina State Superintendent of Education threatened her with jail. That's right. People in the United States used to be able to go to jail if you were homeschooling. And so she battled to make homeschooling legal in the state of South Carolina. In 1990, Zan helped found the South Carolina Association for Independent Home Schools and served as its president for 10 years. She serves as a grassroots director for parentalrights.org to advocate for homeschooling in the media. She's been on the NBC's Today Show, and she's humbled herself to come and talk to me on the Refining Rhetoric podcast. So we're so thankful for having her here. She's worked, written books, written blogs, been a sought-off speaker, and you can find out more about her at zantyler.com. But of course, we'll hear from her directly today. So Zan, thank you so much for being on the show.
Oh, Robert, it is my privilege. I'm happy to be here.
You know, one of the things that people just really can't even comprehend these days is that homeschooling used to be illegal in the United States, and that they used to try to drag parents into the courtrooms, threaten to take their kids away. One of the reasons that I tell people that, why aren't homeschoolers socialized? Well, for about the first 10 years of the homeschooling movement, it might have been illegal what we were doing. And so we were trying to hide. So our parents, wouldn't be taking it away from us. Like I remember my mom saying, don't let the UPS man, see you if he comes by before 3 p.m. because you don't want, Child Protective Services called. So take us back to 1984. Like, what made you all decide to homeschool? And then when did you find out that it was illegal?
Well, in 1984, it's crazy. We didn't know anybody in the world who homeschooled. There were no groups, there were no state organizations. HSLDA had started on the West Coast, but it certainly wasn't a national entity. I had a son who I needed to hold him back a year so that he'd be at his prime for first grade. There were two things I said I'd never do when I was in college. One was teach and the other was have kids. And and so here I was, a stay-at-home mom. The Lord had drastically changed my life plan. I was headed to law school, and we got married and had two babies in the time it would have taken me to go through law school. And so I have this child who's not reading, and I had been diametrically opposed to knowing anything about education, evidently, and I just needed some help. So friends of mine with master's degrees suggested I have tie tested and hold him back. So the school district said, no problem, we agree, you've got the test scores. And then they changed their mind and told me I could put my 6-year-old in their K-5 program. So I had gone to high school in South Carolina. The principal was a friend of mine. He was then associate superintendent. So I just called him and I said, John, can you write a note for me to hold Ty back? The school district has agreed private schools are filled. And he said, oh, Zan, I can't do that. I thought, you do that all the time. And so so I said, well, I guess I'll have to homeschool. And he said, oh, the district's gotten lenient with that, which meant in the history of our school district, there had been one person who was a certified teacher who had homeschooled for 1 year. And so we got off the phone. The state board nor our school district would tell us what the homeschooling law was. We had to hire an attorney to find out what I had to do to homeschool. We followed all those things to the nth degree. The school district turned me down. And so I had this brainstorm. I called my attorney back. He said, well, you're going to end up, the state board will rubber stamp what the school board did. You're going to end up in family court. And I'm telling the Lord, I told you this, I did not want to do this. I told you this was a terrible idea. And, but I had a brainstorm. My mom had been a public school teacher. She was an excellent teacher. And she knew the state superintendent of education, Charlie Williams. He had observed her classroom when I had been in the 4th grade. So I had met him through that whole process. So I just decided to call him. I said, Dr. Williams, this is Zan Tyler. I'm Sybil Peters' daughter. I have a problem. He said, oh, honey, come on up. It was a friendly call. So I expected him to say, you've exhausted your administrative possibilities, which I had done. Let's see what I can do to help you, because you're obviously a mom who loves her child. Instead, he looked at me and he said, if you continue down this path of homeschooling, I will have you put in jail for truancy. And you could have just blown me over with a feather. I was just sort of in a state of shock. And you know that Bible verse that says that God will give us the words when we're confronted with the authorities? The Bible doesn't tell us we might not like the words he gives us. And I can remember saying, it's just he and I in this room. And I heard somebody say, well, Dr. Williams, you'll just have to put me in jail then. And I'm thinking, is there somebody else in this room? Did I just say that? And, it was sort of my Patrick Henry, give me liberty or give me death moment. And I got up and left. So being the brave soul we had been, we had not told either one of our parents that we were planning to homeschool, and we lived within a 3-mile radius of both of them. And I thought, well, my dad was very involved in the South Carolina community on boards and stuff. And I thought, well, the newspaper's going to say, not going to say Zan Tyler goes to jail for homeschooling. It's going to say John Peters' daughter goes to jail for homeschooling. So I thought, I guess I better go tell my parents I'm going to jail before they read about it in the newspaper. So I go by and I tell my parents, at this point, I'd held it together. I tell my parents I'm homeschooling Ty. Bless their hearts. My dad stood behind me this whole way. My mom and dad, the only 2 people in the world. I don't know what they thought. And I left and I was hysterical. And so we knew we had the hearing coming up at the state board level. And when I was in high school, I had been governor of Girl State and Boy State, still a thing. My grandson just went, just not as big a deal as it used to be. And so from that, I started working for one of our U.S. senators, Strom Thurmond. And so Dad was actually speaking at an event with his wife, said Zan's in trouble. And he said, she said, well, let's see what we can do to help her. And so we had a note from his chief of staff the next day that they were going to fax or overnight. No, there was no fax. There was FedEx. Yeah. FedEx the superintendent a letter saying we were legal. Leave me alone. Instead, he flew down. The senator flew down and met with Charlie Williams and said, Charlie, Zan's program is legal. I've looked at it. My staff has looked at it. You need to get off her back and approve this program. And so we stayed out of jail because of that. And so that was our start into homeschooling. I left out the part that a friend of mine gave me a book called Homegrown Kids. And she said, Zan, I'm going to homeschool, and this is what you need to do. And when I read that book, it just, it's a life changer for me to think that there could be education that happened in your home with loving parents, and there's time for service and, your strengths. And I don't know, the book, I've gone back to read it several times, and I'm thinking, this is a good book, but it's not a book that's good enough to take me through jail. And you just have to think, the Holy Spirit just works in the things we read and the people we meet and the experiences we've had. And so we started and we were homeschooling for that 1 year. And at the end of that year, I looked at Joe and I said, Joe, our outward circumstances have been terrible. We had family members, church members, neighbors who wouldn't speak to us or let our kids play with their kids anymore because we were homeschooling. And I said, but what's happened in our home is pretty amazing. And I had been a stay-at-home mom. The kids had been in preschool and kindergarten. And Joe said, "Yep." He said, I was afraid you were going to say that." And so we homeschool. We started homeschooling another year. And that's when we had a knock one night on our door at midnight in November. And Joe traveled then, and I would get a knock on the door at midnight. I think it's social services coming to get my kids, because we're still, we're not out of the woods, although we were spared jail. And it was a neighbor of ours. And he said, "Zan, I hate homeschooling." I said, "I know that, Bill." And he said, "But I am the head of a state department, and the state registry is where legislators or state agencies can promulgate regulations. And if nobody objects, they go into law without the legislature even having to vote on them." And he said, "There are homeschool regulations there that you're going to be interested in. They're going to require homeschooling parents to have a college degree and only use state-approved texts, which cuts the Christian heart out of homeschooling." And so
Right.
that's really what began our legal battle. And I just sort of ran away with that whole story without giving either one of us a chance to breathe. But that's what kicked me into really the civic and political arena for homeschooling. And it took us 8 years to get a good law passed in South Carolina.
Mm,
So
that's heroic. I mean, 8 years, you kind of, you're not going to jail, but there's not really going to be a whole lot of other people that are going to get a senator's signature on allowing them to homeschool either, right?
it was interesting because we were either in court or the legislature each one of those 8 years. So homeschooling, in spite of no social media, this is what makes me think it was really a revival movement, and people all over the country were in the beginnings of these stages of homeschooling. So the number was beginning to grow. And Joe got a Tandy 1000 for Christmas, our first. If you're a tech guy, you can probably imagine what those first desktops were like. And we started keeping up with names of people who were interested in homeschooling, mainly lawyers and literary people with literacy organizations from around the country would call. And so when we actually had to call our first public hearing in South Carolina, I had to prove that we had gotten 25 letters. And so to the State Department of Education, the state superintendent, I asked this list that I had, somehow composed over a 12-month period of time. And I would tell them, you send a hard copy letter and send me a carbon copy letter. I mean, that was the technology. And I thought, Lord, if we get 25 letters requesting this public hearing, otherwise those regs went into legislation, this is going to be a miracle. And we had 125 letters sent in, which was really remarkable. And probably 400 people attend that first public hearing objecting to those regulations. It wasn't a legislative hearing, but it was a public hearing with the Department of Education. And so it was really watching the birth of a grassroots movement. I have no explanation as to where all those people came from. I'd love to say I was this great grassroots developer, but we were plodding along, trying to make inroads in different places without success. And then we have that hearing. And so that was the beginning of a really long fight that we should have never won. But it was, like Mike Ferris always said, is God's blessing on the homeschooling community. That's the only explanation.
Yeah.
So.
No, I know, but Mike more closely than I have and worked with him. But I've, talked to him a number of times, and he's just reiterated, and of course he's told different stories to different groups about how, the homeschooler's back was against the wall, and, some miracle happens and the court allows it to go on or whatnot. So what was that like? So I was born in 83, and so I remember, I was kind of on that tail end of things being legal. I wasn't, I wasn't of mandatory school age until, in the late 80s. And then, but I do remember going to church, and the youth pastor, trying to talk my mom out of homeschooling. And,
Hmm.
there was a couple other people maybe at our church that did homeschool. So, we had a band of us, but it was, very abnormal, and people didn't necessarily know what to do with us and those type of things. Like, how have you seen homeschooling like change? Like, as you look back on the last, 30, 40 years, are there like seasons of like the homeschool movement where you felt like maybe it's more maturing, or like, are there milestones that you remember that our audience should know about?
It's interesting because up through the, I guess, mid 90s, I would say most people, not every state, because states like, North Carolina and Georgia, just states all around me had no issues.
Right.
And but then there were just huge battles in other states. And I would say by the mid 90s, in most states, homeschooling was legal, either through a court case or legislation or, some other means. But it was getting to the point where it was legal. And I remember thinking, um, Lord, is this movement ever going to grow, or is it just going to come to a standstill stop? And because it was always, one parent, usually, this wasn't the days of working from home. So one
Yeah.
parent had given up an income to homeschool, and it wasn't easy, and there weren't tons of resources, although the resources were growing. And so there are different landmarks in my mind. I can remember in 1995, we had gotten a new superintendent elected in South Carolina, and I was invited along with the local school superintendents to attend this forum on technology and education. Was right at the advent of the internet. And I remember, I was really not welcome in this crowd, but I enjoyed myself immensely. And I was like this fly on the wall. And I remember hearing all these superintendents saying to each other, do you think we'll really ever have internet in the classrooms? Do you know how to get on the internet? These were the conversations. And I remember thinking then that technology and education may be an avenue of growth, but it was still so new. That was still in everybody's, this is way out there thinking. But in 1999, I was just talking on my podcast about this. I got a call. My second son was graduating from high school. And by the time the boys graduated, we killed the fatted calf. We had our pig because we had a barbecue for like 200 or 300 people. And, we're celebrating because we have really been through it to get to this point. And I got a phone call when we were getting ready for all these people coming over. I thought it was Joe's best friend pranking me. Because he said, hey, Zan, this is so-and-so with the Today Show. We were thinking about flying you up to do a spot. I said, Hal, nobody got time for this. I got to go, and hung up. And so I get this call back a few minutes later, and it's, Zan, I'm not Hal. Don't hang up. And he said, we'd like to do a piece on homeschooling. And I said, well, this is a hit piece. I'm not interested. By this time, I've been through all the journalistic hit pieces I care to be a part of. And he said, no, this is an informative piece. And I said, can you tell me why? And he said, well, it's Columbine. And so this was May of 1990, and I think Columbine was April 20th of 1990. And he said for the first time, people who said they would never homeschool are thinking about homeschooling because of the safety issues in school. People are scared.
Mhm.
And so it was interesting where I thought homeschooling would hit a dead end, which probably Mike Ferris never did because he was such a visionary, and I was working hard to be, but was not, by nature at that point, and I just thought this is what took homeschooling into the next level. There were a couple of things. The changes in the culture that were coming more rapidly than people could anticipate, the violence in the schools, and the technology that allowed people to work from home. So one parent could be working from home while another was, working outside the home, but somehow homeschooling was happening. And so, so that was just a huge jump in the numbers. And then, like Al Mohler said, the culture kept rotting rapidly. And so I think more and more Christians were open to homeschooling. And then COVID hit. And it just blew all the barriers out of the water when COVID hit. And we all know what happened to the homeschooling numbers then. So it's like every time I thought homeschooling would just sort of die a noble death because it's too hard or too expensive or not enough resources, it's like the Lord would open another avenue. And so, although people will start homeschooling for, not negative reasons, I mean, wanting to keep your kids safe is not a negative reason, but then you discover all the positive benefits of homeschooling. The closeness of the family, being able to use a curriculum that supports your faith, your children's faith, instead of fights with it. Tutorial method of homeschooling. Our kids grow up to serve and be involved in the community. I don't know. You can talk about the benefits of homeschooling for hours and never get tired of it. And so I just think once people taste that freedom and that essence of homeschooling, then it's just hard to ignore.
The Classical Learning Cohort is comprised of small groups of CC parents learning how to become more confident, competent classical teachers. We provide a welcoming place of mentorship while practicing classical skills and hospitable assessment. With feedback from peers and mentors, you will experience transformational growth as a classical Christian educator. Why not sample the CLC by attending a free online event with a CLC member? Go to classicalconversations.com/cohort and search Experience a CLC event to find a time that fits your schedule.
I agree. And there's the benefits are so enormous that, it's a struggle, but it's worth it, right? Usually good things are hard.
That's right.
Right. But you see, killing the fatted, calf or the getting the big barbecue for the graduation. So I remember when I was going to college, I went to Clemson, so I went to school in South Carolina. But I remember because I graduated in 2000. That not all colleges accepted homeschooling.
That's right.
Then.
That's right.
So how did your kids Clemson obviously did because I got in. But yeah, what was that like trying to figure that out? Because now, parents are like, how am I going to get my kids into college? I'm like, every single college has like a homeschool recruiter now.
Yes, that's exactly right. That's exactly right.
Let me tell you about my day. But yeah, how was that for y'all?
Yes, that's exactly right. Well, it was a lot of work. And so both of my boys played soccer. Of course, there were no Tim Tebow laws back then, and but they were both college level athletes. And we were interested in Covenant College because we knew one of the professors there well, Dr. Krabendam, and we thought how great for our kids to go to a Christian college. And so the soccer coach got real interested in Ty. And so that's how he ended up at Covenant. But it was really a process. There was no this is what you do if you're a homeschooled student. Or like you say, no recruiter knocking down our doors because, and people would say all the time, when we started homeschooling, it was hilarious because the boys were 6 and 4 and people would say, is it legal? What about socialization? And then they'd say, well, what about the prom, PE, and physics? And then, so that was layer number 2. And then they'd say, and your kids will never go to college. So how they're going to support a family. So those were the crazy things that people always were kind of their battering ram with me. But, it's amazing because I've talked to college recruiters now by the dozens because like you, I mean, you're talking to homeschoolers all over the country. And they've told me 3 things. This probably doesn't answer the question you asked me, but I think it's so fascinating. They said, Zan, when people started talking to us about homeschooling, we thought if there's going to be any group of kids that has their head buried in the sand when it's time for college, it's going to be those kids. And yet they come to our campuses and they're the most independent learners we have. They know what to do with the syllabus. They know nobody's going to hold their hand to help them get the job done, and they do their work. And he said, now here's the crazy thing. so now we realize they're great students, but we think there's no way they'll be leaders. And these kids come to school and they take leadership on our campus. And he said that's really where our mind is blown, because we thought if there was anybody who didn't know what was going on in the world and would not be socialized, it would be your kids. So it's like on every front, our kids have baffled them. And which I think is fabulous, because our kids are heavily recruited now. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, it is. The world's wisdom is foolishness, and God's wisdom is not. So yeah, it's been a really fun journey. What are some of the things that you're seeing, like in today's post COVID? The world's kind of, they kept talking about the new normal. A lot of us pushed back against that, but things have changed. Like there are, homeschool organizations and, almost every state now. And I know that you talked to a lot of them as, a former leader of the South Carolina one. Like, what are some of the things that you would want, maybe new homeschoolers or new organizations? Like, what are some of those core values that we saw that made the homeschooling movement great that, people just coming in might take for granted?
I know that homeschooling has a lot of different types of people now, mainly because of COVID opened the eyes of so many parents and different types of parents. But I still think one of the big draws for parents, especially Christian parents of faith, is that we can raise our children with high academic standards. I mean, education was important to us, but it doesn't fight with their faith. I love and I know your work with Classical Conversations, and I work with BJU Press and Homeschool, and the joy of providing resources for Christian parents it may be the pinnacle of my existence. The community you've created, the curriculum, all of that. I just think there's such a roadmap now for nobody has to homeschool alone. When we started, you homeschooled alone, you had no community. And I think that's where your mom and you have been so brilliant in developing such a strong community. And now the homeschooling community is strong. And I think the other thing is there's so many resources now. And so, there are video classes, there are internet classes, there are co-ops, there are hybrid schools, there's CC. There are a lot of options for people, just really good resources. And we know the end game for our kids. If they want to go to college, the colleges are open. They want to go to trade school, they can go to trade school. And if they're entrepreneurial, homeschooling, the sky's the limit. And the military, we Joe and I were invited to attend the Army Educators Tour a couple of years ago. And so this was mainly made up of public school superintendents, and they had us as homeschool representatives. And I think one other person was there from the homeschool community. And so I remember there was a 2-star general who's now a 3-star general, and he was in charge of, overall in charge. And I got to talk to him after the banquet was over. And I said, General, I have to say that the military has been pretty awful to homeschoolers historically. I mean, in the early years, it didn't matter how well our kids did on the SAT or any other measure. We had to take the GED. You wouldn't accept our diplomas. And so I kind of went through the litany of things. HSLDA had all these fights trying to get our kids into officers, just all of these things. Yeah. And I said, so what changed your mind? Why am I here? And he said, well, Zan, when COVID started, we started having some online graduations. Our toughest course, I always butcher the name of the course, Robert, but it's about explosives explosive devices, IEDs,
Yeah.
but that's not the name of the course. But he said it's physics, it's chemistry, it's our toughest class. So we had our graduation. And so I like to recognize the top 3 students in their high schools. So, and I think these were all 3 young men. And so he said, I said to the third top graduate, well, son, where did you go to high school? And he said, well, I was homeschooled. And he said, well, my congratulations to your parents. And then he said to the salutatorian, son, where did you go to school? He said, oh, I was homeschooled. And he said, my congratulations to your parents. And so he said, how did I know when I got to the valedictorian what he was going to say? So I said, son, where did you go to school? He said, oh, I was homeschooled. And he said, at that moment in time, I thought, we are missing the boat. And he said that really changed his mind, changed a lot of people's mind. And, my feeling is, Robert, most of us are raising our kids to love America. And you don't want to die for a country that you don't love. And when our children are in a system that teaches them to challenge every ideal in America and to hate America, who's going to trust them to fight for our country? And so, he just said at that time, I think they've overcome this now, but they had recruiting gaps in all 4 branches of the military. And homeschoolers were doing well on the ASVAB. They were more physically fit because they weren't gaming all the time. And he said, and it was just a real logical fit for us. And so, I think a real long answer to a question about how is homeschooling different, I think parents can relax and know that there's a good end to their homeschooling.
No, yeah, I think, that was one of the things that, people always ask me, did I always think I was going to work for CC? Well, first of all, CC didn't have enough money to pay me. I graduated from college because, my parents weren't taking a paycheck at that point. Yeah, I wanted to prove to myself too that this education that my mom gave me was successful. And so I, worked with a couple Fortune 50 companies, a small manufacturing company, down in Batesburg, Leesville.
Yes, where Sheely's is. Did you ever eat at Sheely's?
Well, I ate a lot at Sheely's. It's delicious. So every once in a while, I think I should just drive down there and eat again.
Well, call us. We'll meet you there and take you out.
All right. That sounds delicious. So I just want to wrap up because, one of the things that we've seen a rise in more homeschool legislation in states like Illinois and New Jersey, maybe Pennsylvania's trying to do something. I can't remember. California's got some stuff going on. Like, we fought all these legal battles. We won them. Colleges are recruiting our kids. The military wants our kids. I get emails from business owners all the time. Like, hey, is there any kid I can recruit to come work for me instead of going to college? Like, everybody wants them, but we still got states that want to stifle this freedom. Like, what's going on here? Like, why do we have to be eternally vigilant as homeschooling advocates?
That is really well said and a great question. We had, I would say, really 20 years. I know HSLDA had things to do every day, multiple things to do every day of those 20 years. But for some reason, last year became the first year that we saw legislative issues like in 8 or 9 states that were in any way commensurate with what we had gone through in the 80s and early 90s. This law in New Jersey, they want to interview every parent who's homeschooling and give them a chance to, quote, get their advice on education from a school district person. And then they want to do a well check of every child. That's one of the most egregious things I've ever heard. In Virginia, they wanted to do away with the religious exemption. In Illinois, that was a whole other thing. And Connecticut, all these states, it's just it baffles the mind. And so I just think people have said to me, Zan, now that homeschooling is so big, I don't know why we have to worry about freedom anymore. And like you said, the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. I said, we are so big, it makes for a bigger target. And, we're affecting teachers' pension funds because not as many teachers are teaching. And some schools are combining classes. So there are a few schools that have gone out of business because there's so many people homeschooling now. And I think that the thing that bothers me the most about this whole new series of legislation, it is like all of these legislators, all of these people are looking at homeschool parents as though they're guilty until proven innocent. They're sure we're guilty of educational neglect and child abuse and all these other things. And we all hate all of those things. And we're certainly, as a movement, we are innocent of those things and should be innocent till proven guilty. There are laws on the books to take care of all of that. But the language is designed, I think, their whole narrative is designed to make us look guilty until proven innocent, put us on the defensive, make everybody think that every child who's homeschooled needs to be checked out. Well, what about every child in the public school system?
Yeah,
what about
they're checked out every day.
Yes, what about the educational neglect there? I mean, it just, all of this defies our imagination. And then, there was Elizabeth Bartholet from Harvard right during COVID who wanted a presumptive ban on homeschooling. And while her timing with COVID was terrible for her, there are always going to be parents who think, there are always going to be people who think parental rights emanates from the state and not from God. And I'm just sad that we're going to have to start fighting all those battles, but we are going to have to, I'm afraid, fight this state by state once again. I just want to say, we just as leaders in just the state homeschool organization arena, that we so appreciate the support and help that CC is given at this point in time, because boy, if there was a time we all ever had to come together as a community, it's now.
We appreciate that, Zan, and we appreciate everything that the state organizations are doing to keep homeschooling legal. We want, if you're listening to this and you're not a member of your state homeschool organization, become a member. If you're not a member of HSLDA, become a member. These are very inexpensive, easy ways to protect your freedom and your liberty, because it'll go away very quickly if we keep our eye off the ball. And these organizations have proven time and time again that they will keep their eye on the ball. They'll do it for pennies on the dollar. I mean,
that's right.
They things that you have to pay someone up in Raleigh, North Carolina, some sort of, $1,500 an hour or something to get something done, homeschool moms do for free, basically.
Yeah,
so
that's right.
You can't put a price on what these organizations have done over the last 30, 40 years to keep us free. And it's not something that happened by accident. And obviously God was faithful because our hearts and minds were in the right spots. So we have to be, each generation is going to have to keep fighting this fight, and we can't rest on our laurels because we think that it's not going to happen.
Well, amen to that. That's right. We all need to be involved for sure.
Well, Zan, I know everyone enjoyed today's podcast, so they can find you on zantyler.com. But we'll give you the last word. What would you like to leave our audience with?
Well, I just want to say that homeschooling is an amazing way to raise your children, to grow a strong family. We want our kids to know the Lord. So if you haven't homeschooled, I would encourage you to look into it. If you are homeschooling, I would encourage you to have great perseverance, because the fruit and the outcomes are definitely worth all that parents put into it. And like you said, Robert, people can find me at zantyler.com and on my podcast, The Zan Tyler Show. And thank you so much for all you've done for homeschool freedom and for the homeschooling community. And thank you for having me here. It's a real privilege and honor.
Oh, well, thank you so much. It was a lot of fun. I hope everyone enjoyed today's episode. Share it with a friend, and we'll see you next week at the Refining Rhetoric podcast. God bless.
Thank you for listening to Refining Rhetoric with Robert Bortins. Want more? Make sure to subscribe so you won't miss an episode. You can also follow us on social media to continue the conversation, and visit classicalconversations.com/rhetoric to find out how you can join a local homeschool community.